Most people think regret hits an avoidant the moment you walk away. That's the popular story. You leave, you disappear, and suddenly they're overwhelmed with loss. But that's not how the avoidant nervous system works. In fact, in the beginning, your absence often feels like relief to them. Relief from emotional pressure, relief from expectations, relief from the intensity of being seen. And if you don't understand this, you'll keep waiting for a reaction that doesn't come, and you'll think it means you didn't matter. That assumption is not only wrong, it's psychologically backwards. Avoidants are wired to regulate themselves through distance. When closeness increases, their nervous system interprets it as a threat, not because you did something wrong, but because intimacy activates old survival patterns. So when you leave or when things go quiet, their system finally settles. The anxiety drops. The tension releases. From the outside, it looks like they've moved on easily. On the inside, what's happening is something far more subtle. They are returning to a familiar emotional baseline where control feels possible again. And this is the critical point most people miss. Regret does not arise in an avoidant from loss alone. It arises from a loss of control. Not control in a manipulative sense, but emotional predictability. When you were invested, when you were trying to fix things, explain yourself, or stay connected, you were emotionally available in a way that felt familiar to them. Even if they pushed you away, they still sensed your presence. They knew where you were emotionally. That predictability created safety on their terms. So when you disappear, at first nothing collapses. There is no immediate panic. But then something changes. Time passes, and instead of coming back anxious, reactive, or pleading for clarity, you come back, or you don't come back at all, different, calmer, more grounded, less reactive. You stop asking the same questions. You stop trying to be understood at any cost. And that shift is what destabilizes them, because now they can't read you. Strength is confusing to an avoidant when it isn't paired with pursuit. Confidence that doesn't demand reassurance breaks the emotional pattern they're used to. Your independence removes their reference point. They no longer know where they stand. And this is where regret begins. Not because they lost you physically, but because they lost emotional access to the version of you they understood. This is also why avoidants often reappear when you're doing well, not when you're broken. When you're struggling, your pain confirms their internal story that closeness leads to chaos, dependence, and emotional burden. But when you're stable, fulfilled, and no longer seeking their validation, it contradicts their belief system. It forces them to confront a painful truth, that the problem was never your neediness, but their avoidance of emotional responsibility. At that moment, something philosophical happens. They realize they weren't escaping you. They were escaping themselves, and seeing you thrive without them becomes a mirror they can't avoid. Your growth exposes the cost of their patterns, not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in a quiet, haunting one, the kind that shows up late at night, when distractions fade and self-justification stops working. Regret for an avoidant is not emotional overwhelm, it's cognitive dissonance. It's the slow realization that the distance they relied on for safety also cost them connection. And when they see that you didn't fall apart without them, that you didn't need them to regulate your emotions, the illusion of control collapses. That's why this regret doesn't scream. It simmers. It doesn't beg. It watches. It shows up as curiosity, as checking in, as subtle attempts to re-enter your emotional field. Not because they suddenly learned how to love differently, but because your strength disrupted their internal equilibrium. And here's the part you need to hear, especially if you're still measuring your worth by their reaction. Your power was never in leaving. Your power was in becoming emotionally sovereign. The moment you stopped organizing your emotional world around their availability, you stepped into a position they no longer understood and therefore could no longer control. That is when the regret begins, because the avoidant doesn't regret losing you when you're gone. They regret it when you're strong enough that they can't reach you anymore. After that first realization sets in that you're no longer emotionally reachable in the way you once were, a deeper layer of regret begins to surface. And this one cuts differently. This is the regret of not valuing you while you were choosing them, not after you left, not when the silence stretched on, but back when you were still there, still investing, still believing that consistency and patience could create safety. Avoidants often don't recognize value in real time. Their attention isn't oriented toward what is present. It's oriented toward what feels overwhelming. So when you showed up with loyalty, emotional availability, and a genuine desire to build something, it didn't register as something rare. It registered as pressure, as expectation, as something they'd eventually have to live up to. And because they couldn't reconcile that internally, they minimize it externally. This is where people misunderstand avoidant behavior and take it personally. They assume dismissiveness equals indifference. It doesn't. It often equals fear of obligation. The more reliable you were, the more it highlighted their inconsistency. The more patient you became, the more it exposed their avoidance. So instead of meeting your effort with appreciation, they unconsciously devalued it. Not because it lacked worth, but because acknowledging it would have required accountability. When you were choosing them, you were giving something most people don't know how to give anymore: emotional steadiness. You weren't just offering affection, you were offering presence. You were saying in subtle ways, I'm here. I'm not leaving at the first discomfort. And for someone who equates closeness with loss of autonomy, that kind of commitment feels heavy, even when it's healthy. So they pulled back. They delayed. They stayed vague. They let you do the emotional labor of clarity while they stayed safely undefined. And in doing so, they taught themselves a dangerous lie, that your consistency was guaranteed, that you'd always be there, adapting, waiting, understanding. That lie is comforting in the short term and devastating in the long term, because value is often invisible when it's stable. Chaos gets attention. Inconsistency creates urgency. But reliability gets taken for granted, especially by someone whose nervous system has learned to confuse intensity with connection. So while you were choosing them daily, they were postponing the choice, assuming there would always be more time. And then one day that time runs out. The regret doesn't come from losing the relationship itself. It comes from realizing what you represented. They start replaying moments they once dismissed: your patience during their withdrawal, your calm during their uncertainty, your willingness to communicate instead of disappear. Those moments reframe themselves. What once felt like pressure now looks like devotion. What once felt ordinary now feels irreplaceable. This is also why avoidants often idealize partners only after they're gone. It's not that you suddenly became valuable. It's that the emotional distance finally allows them to feel without having to respond, without responsibility, without expectation. In absence, they can safely admire what they were too defended to honor in presence. Philosophically, this is the tragedy of avoidance. By refusing to engage fully in the present, they live in constant retrospection. They understand love most clearly when it's no longer asking anything of them. And that delayed awareness becomes the soil where regret grows. But here's the part that matters for you. And this is where power quietly shifts. You don't need them to recognize your value for it to be real. Their regret is not your validation. It's merely evidence. Evidence that what you gave had weight, that what you offered required courage, that choosing someone consistently even when they're unsure is not weakness. It's emotional strength. When they finally realize what they lost, it's not just a person, it's the version of themselves they could have been if they had risen to meet you. That's the unspoken grief beneath the regret, the awareness that you were an opportunity for growth, not just connection. And that's why this regret lingers, because they didn't just fail to choose you, they failed to choose the deeper version of themselves that you were inviting them to become. They didn't lose you because you weren't enough. They lost you because they didn't recognize the value of someone who was choosing them while they still had the chance. Once the avoidant begins to sense what they lost and how they failed to value it in real time, the dynamic shifts again. This is where silence enters the picture, not as a tactic, not as punishment, but as a natural consequence of your emotional withdrawal. And silence for an avoidant is not empty. It is confrontational. For most of the relationship, you were the translator of emotion. You asked the questions. You clarified the misunderstandings. You tried to resolve what went unsaid. Even when they withdrew, you filled the space with effort, with explanations, with emotional availability. That dynamic allowed them to avoid themselves. As long as you were speaking, feeling, and reaching, they didn't have to sit with their inner world. Your presence buffered them from introspection. So when that presence disappears, when you stop explaining, stop chasing closure, stop trying to be understood, something profound happens. The avoidant is left alone with their own thoughts. And unlike distance that they choose, this silence is imposed by consequence. It is not relief. It is exposure. Avoidant individuals rely heavily on external regulation, distraction, work, new connections, stimulation, anything that keeps emotional discomfort at bay. But silence removes those buffers. It slows everything down. It creates space. And in that space, the very feelings they avoided begin to surface, not as emotion first, but as rumination, replayed conversations, half-remembered moments, the awareness of what was left unresolved. This is why your silence becomes louder than any argument ever was. Arguments can be dismissed. Emotions can be minimized. But silence cannot be debated. It doesn't demand. It doesn't accuse. It simply exists and forces reflection. And for someone whose coping strategy is to move away from discomfort, reflection is deeply unsettling. Psychologically, silence triggers what avoidants fear most: internal accountability. Without you there to anchor the narrative, they have to create their own explanation, and slowly the story shifts. It's no longer things were too intense or they wanted too much. It becomes, I didn't show up and I never really tried. That reframing doesn't happen overnight, but it is inevitable when silence is sustained. There is also something else happening beneath the surface. Silence removes reassurance. Avoidance often feels secure, not through closeness, but through knowing they still matter, even at a distance. When you stop checking in, stop reacting, stop responding in predictable ways, that unspoken reassurance disappears and uncertainty creeps in, not about the relationship, but about their impact on you. They start to wonder if they ever mattered in the way they assumed they did, and that question is destabilizing because it touches a core wound avoidants rarely acknowledge: the fear of being emotionally insignificant, not rejected, but irrelevant. Your silence forces them to confront that fear without the option of escape. This is why silence often leads to delayed reactions, late-night messages, indirect check-ins, sudden curiosity about your life. These aren't expressions of emotional clarity. They're attempts to restore equilibrium, to confirm that they still exist in your emotional world. Silence threatens that assumption. Philosophically, silence is the absence of resistance. You are no longer pushing against their behavior, no longer trying to change the dynamic. And when resistance disappears, the truth has nothing to push against. It stands on its own. Your silence says, without words, this is where I stop participating in what hurts me. And that boundary forces recognition. For you, this is not about strategy. It's about self-respect. When you stop explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you, you reclaim your energy. You return emotion. Our responsibility to where it belongs. And that shift is felt, even if it's never acknowledged aloud. Silence doesn't make the avoidant miss your voice. It makes them hear their own. And that is the moment regret deepens, because what they avoided emotionally now follows them mentally in every quiet moment they can't escape. Your silence is not absence. It is consequence. And in that consequence, the truth finally has room to speak. When you stop talking, the avoidant doesn't lose you. They lose the distraction that kept them from facing themselves. As silence does its work and the avoidant is left to confront themselves, another realization begins to surface, one that is far more destabilizing than loss or loneliness. They begin to see that their behavior didn't just push you away, it shaped you. And this is where the regret sharpens, because they didn't simply lose you, they taught you how to walk away. Avoidants often believe abandonment is what they fear most. In reality, it's not abandonment, it's the loss of influence. As long as you were emotionally engaged, explaining yourself, waiting, hoping, adjusting, they still mattered in your inner world. Even when they withdrew, they could feel your presence. That presence gave them a sense of relevance. It allowed them to stay distant without feeling erased. But over time, something shifts in you. Not suddenly, not dramatically, gradually. Each unanswered message, each emotional shutdown, each moment of inconsistency trains your nervous system to detach. You stop reaching out not because you're playing a game, but because your system learns that closeness is not reciprocated. Detachment becomes self-protection. And here's the paradox. The more they pull away, the more independent you become. The more they delay, the less you rely on them. Without intending to, they condition you to function without emotion. Feedback. And once that process is complete, there is no leverage left. This is when they notice. Not when you leave, but when you stop reacting. When their behavior no longer produces an emotional response. When distance no longer creates anxiety in you. That's the moment they realize they miscalculated. They thought withdrawal would keep you invested. Instead, it freed you. Psychologically, this strikes at the avoidance core defense. They regulate closeness by controlling access. When you want more, they pull back. When you pull back, they feel safer. But when you stop needing altogether, the system collapses. There is no longer a push-pull dynamic to manage, no rhythm to retreat from, no emotional gravity pulling you toward them, and that loss of influence is deeply unsettling. Because now, they can't re-engage you through distance. The tactic that once worked no longer has an effect. They may try to resurface to reassert connection, but the old hooks don't land. You've changed, not in anger, not in bitterness, in awareness. This is where regret becomes personal. They start to see that their avoidance didn't protect the relationship, it dismantled it, not explosively, but methodically, piece by piece. And the most painful realization is this: you didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because you learned how to care for yourself. Philosophically, this is the consequence of unexamined patterns. Every behavior teaches something, and their behavior taught you that love without presence is unsustainable, that effort without reciprocity is self-abandonment, that waiting for potential is a form of self-betrayal. These lessons don't fade, they integrate. So when the avoidant looks back, they're not just mourning the relationship, they're confronting the fact that they created the very outcome they feared. By withholding, they trained you to let go. B, avoiding, they taught you independence. By staying emotionally unavailable, they made themselves unnecessary. And this is why reconnection, when it happens, feels so different. They sense that you no longer revolve around them, that your world has expanded, that they are no longer the axis of your emotional life. And that awareness carries weight, because influence once lost is rarely regained. For you, this shift is not something to regret. It's a rite of passage. You didn't become cold, you became clear. You didn't harden, you grounded, and that groundedness changes how people can access you. The avoidant's deepest regret is not that you walked away, it's that they unknowingly trained you to stop needing them. And once you learned that lesson, there was no way back. Once the avoidant realizes they've lost influence, that they can no longer reach you through distance or silence, another layer of regret begins to surface. And this one follows them wherever they go. It's the comparison regret. Not dramatic, not obvious, quiet, persistent, and deeply unsettling. Avoidants often move on quickly, or at least appear to. New connections, casual attention, fresh stimulation, these aren't signs of emotional recovery, they're strategies of regulation. Novelty provides a temporary sense of control. It creates the illusion of freedom without requiring depth. And at first, this feels like relief. There are no expectations, no emotional responsibility, no need to show up fully, but something doesn't land. The initial attraction might be there. The chemistry might even be intense. Yet over time, a subtle emptiness emerges. Conversations don't go as deep. Emotional resonance feels limited. There's a sense of something missing that's hard to name. And that's when the comparisons begin. Not consciously at first, but reflexively. They remember how you listened. Not just to respond, but to understand. They remember how you stayed emotionally present even when things were uncomfortable, how you created safety without demanding performance. These memories surface not as nostalgia, but as contrast. The present connection highlights the absence of what you once provided. This is where avoidants encounter a painful truth. Chemistry can be replicated, but emotional attunement cannot. Attraction is easy to find. Depth is not. And the more they try to recreate what they had with you, the clearer it becomes that what they lost wasn't a feeling, it was an experience of being met. Psychologically, this creates internal conflict. Avoidants value autonomy, but they also crave resonance. They want connection without exposure, intimacy without vulnerability. And with you, they came closer to that balance than they realized at the time. Only now, through comparison, do they see how rare it was. Every new connection becomes a mirror, not in a dramatic sense, but in small, telling moments. When they share something personal and it doesn't land, when they withdraw and no one notices, when they test distance and no one comes closer. And slowly the realization forms what you gave wasn't common, it was exceptional. This is not romantic idealization, it's recognition through absence. When emotional safety disappears, its value becomes undeniable. And that recognition carries regret because it reveals a missed opportunity, not just to keep you, but to grow. Philosophically, this speaks to a deeper human pattern. We don't always understand the value of something while we're inside it. We understand it when we step into environments where it no longer exists. And for avoidants who often intellectualize emotion, lived comparison becomes the teacher they can't escape. This is why regret intensifies over time, not fades. The more connections they have, the more data they collect. And the data points back to you. Not because you were perfect, but because you offered something rare, emotional steadiness paired with authenticity. You didn't overwhelm, you didn't perform, you showed up. And here's the part that shifts the power dynamic completely. They don't regret losing you because they can't replace you physically. They regret it because they can't replace the way they felt around you. That sense of being accepted without being chased, known without being trapped, challenged without being controlled, that combination is not common. And once it's gone, it becomes the standard by which everything else is measured. For you, this comparison regret is not something you need to witness to validate your worth. It operates quietly, internally, long after contact has ended. You don't need to be present for it to exist. Your absence is enough. What they're really grieving is not the relationship, but the realization that connection, without depth, leaves them lonelier than they were with you. That safety without resonance feels hollow. That freedom without intimacy isn't fulfilling. And this is why, no matter how many new faces pass through their life, you remain a reference point. Not because you're unforgettable in a dramatic sense, but because you set a baseline they can't unknow. They don't miss you because no one else came along. They miss you because everyone else revealed what you quietly gave and what they failed to recognize until it was gone. And after all of this, after the loss of control, the delayed recognition of your value, the weight of silence, the awareness that they trained you to walk away, and the comparisons that follow them into every new connection, there is one final realization that sits beneath all the others. This is the one that lingers, the one that doesn't fade with time, the one that defines the regret. They realize you healed without them, not slowly, not loudly, but completely. For the avoidant, this is not just painful, it's disorienting. Because somewhere deep in their emotional framework lives an unspoken assumption that distance keeps them safe, and that people who get close eventually need them to regulate their emotions. When you were in their life, even as they pulled away, there was still a sense that you were oriented toward them, that your emotional state was in some way connected to their availability. But healing breaks that assumption. When you stop organizing your emotional world around their presence or absence, the dynamic fundamentally changes. You don't just recover from the relationship. You transcend it. And for an avoidant, that creates a rupture in identity, because now they are no longer the reference point in your story. This is where regret deepens into something more existential. They don't just miss you, they question their impact. They wonder whether they mattered in the way they thought they did, whether they were ever as central to you as they believed. And that question is unsettling because it challenges a quiet sense of significance that distance once preserved. Psychologically, avoidance often maintains self-worth through non-attachment. They tell themselves they don't need deep connection to be okay. But when they see you thriving independently, not bitter, not withdrawn, not waiting, that narrative cracks. Your healing becomes evidence that emotional closeness was never the liability they believed it to be. And here's the paradox. Your growth does not punish them. It reveals them. It exposes the cost of their avoidance, not through accusation, but through contrast. You evolved. They stayed the same. And that asymmetry is impossible to ignore. They may notice it in subtle ways. You speak differently now. Your energy is calmer. Your boundaries are clearer. You no longer explain yourself excessively or seek reassurance. You don't react the way you used to. There's a sense of emotional self-sufficiency that wasn't there before. And that presence, that groundedness, is both admirable and inaccessible. This is why avoidants often feel drawn back not when you're hurting, but when you're whole. Pain confirms their belief that closeness creates dependence. Healing contradicts it. Your independence forces them to confront the possibility that emotional intimacy doesn't weaken people, it strengthens them. Philosophically, this is the ultimate consequence of avoidance. By refusing to grow through relationship, they miss the very transformation relationship offers. And when they see that you access that transformation without them, regret becomes inseparable from self-reflection. Because now, it's not just about what they lost, it's about who they failed to become. They may feel pride for you. They may feel curiosity. They may even feel longing. But underneath all of it is a quiet recognition you didn't need their validation to heal. You didn't need their closure. You didn't need their return. And that truth dissolves the last illusion of control. For you, this is the final shift in power. Not because you won, but because you let go. You chose growth over waiting, integration over explanation, self-respect over potential. And that choice changed everything. The avoidant's greatest regret is not that you moved on, it's that you became whole without them, and in doing so, you left them behind in the very patterns they never had the courage to outgrow. At the end of all of this, the story is not really about the avoidant. It never was. Their regret, their realizations, their delayed awareness, those are side effects, not the point. The real transformati happens on your side of the equation. You didn't win because they finally understood. You didn't heal because they felt remorse. You didn't grow because they came back or reached out. You grew because you stopped abandoning yourself in order to keep someone else comfortable. You chose clarity over confusion, presence over potential, self-respect over hope. And that's the quiet power in this entire journey. When you stop chasing emotional availability from someone who can't offer it, you reclaim your energy. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop explaining what should be felt. And in that space, something profound happens. You become emotionally sovereign. The avoidance regret is simply evidence of a universal truth. What we refuse to face eventually teaches us through loss. They didn't lose you because you were too much. They lost you because they never learned how to be enough for intimacy. But here's the final truth to carry with you. And this is where the story closes with strength, not resentment. You don't need to be remembered, missed, or regretted to be powerful. Your peace is the proof. Your growth is the closure. Your ability to love without losing yourself is the victory. And if there is one thing the avoidant comes to understand too late, it is this. They didn't lose you when you walked away. They lost you the moment you chose yourself and never looked back.